everyone, welcome back to another exciting tutorial video. In this video, I'll walk you through on how to create a simple pivot table from your dataset in Google Sheets. I'll be using the same spreadsheet from my previous videos. In this sheet, I use the XLOOKUP function to bring in data. If you missed that and want to see how it's done, check out the video on my channel or click the link below to watch. Now let's get started. Here I have a vehicle sales report which I'll be using to create a data summary with a pivot table. I'll head over to the menu bar and click on the insert option. This brings a drop-down list of various options. I'll go ahead and select the pivot table option. That's our main focus for this tutorial. Immediately I click on it, the create pivot table dialog box pops up. Here I have the data range and also the insert to option, which is either to insert to a new sheet or an existing sheet. I will be using both options in this video, so stay with me to the end. You don't want to miss it. For the start of this tutorial, I'll be leaving it at the new sheet option because I want my data summary to have a standalone sheet. Moving back to the data range option, because I am currently on the sheet that I'll be using as my source data, the whole data sheet range has been selected. I'll also be showing you how to manually select your data range later on in this video. For now, everything looks good. I'll go on to click on the create button. Immediately, it takes me to a new sheet with an empty pivot table. It shows where the rows, columns, and values data would appear. I'll start by selecting my rows data. At the right side of the sheet, you'll notice a panel called the Pivot Table Editor. This is where you select your data column that appears in your dataset. There are two different ways to add your dataset column headers to the pivot table. First, I'll be using the Add button. I'll go on to click on the Add button, and a list of my dataset column headers shows up. For my first pivot table, I'll be selecting the product name. Immediately I select that, the row section of the pivot table gets populated with all the product names from my dataset. Also, the column section shows the title, product name. Next, I'll go on to add my values. For this, I would like to see the total quantity sold for each product and also the total sale value for each product. I'll be selecting that to populate my pivot table. I'll go on to edit my columns title by changing the sum to total since I use the sum aggregation. Although you can choose to change the aggregation type, I'll show you in a bit, so stay with me. I'll do some text formatting to wrap my text to fit into the column width. Now I have my first pivot table created and also populated with summarized data from my dataset. I'll go on to create my second pivot table for this tutorial. This time, I'll stay in my pivot table sheet and repeat the same process by heading to the menu bar and click on Insert, then select Pivot Table option. For this pivot table, I'll be using the existing sheet option since I want it created in the pivot table sheet. I'll go on to select my data range by clicking on the table icon. Immediately I click on it, it brings up the Select a Data Range dialog box. Here, there are suggestions based on the different data sheets. Since the suggestions contains the data range I want, I'll go ahead and select the vehicle sales report data range. Then I'll click OK. Next, I'll go ahead to select where I want to insert the pivot table. Since I'll be using the existing sheet option, I'll select the data range by clicking on the table icon. Immediately, the What Location dialog box pops up. I'll gently drag that to the side to select the cell location. I want this to be in cell E1, so I'll select that, then click OK. Once I'm done selecting the requirements, I'll click on Create, and immediately the empty pivot table and the panel appears on the sheet. I'll head over to the Pivot Table Editor panel to populate my pivot table. This time, instead of using the Add button, I'll be dragging the data I want to populate in the row section. I'll start by dragging the manufacturer into the row section. Next, I'll scroll down to the value section and drag in the quantity sold and the total sale value under the value section. Once that's done, I'll edit and format the columns title. For my last pivot table, I'll go through the same process by selecting Insert on the menu bar, then select the Pivot Table option, and then the Create Pivot Table dialog box pops up. I'll start by selecting my data range by clicking on the table icon. For this pivot table, I will not be making use of the suggested option. Rather, I will be manually selecting my data range. I'll do this by first heading over to my data table sheet, which is a vehicle sales report sheet. Then I'll click on the first cell and press Ctrl+A on my keyboard to select all the data. Once it shows in my data range box, I'll click OK. Next, I'll click on the existing sheet option and select my location for the pivot table by clicking on the table icon. Immediately, the location dialog box pops up. I'll head over to my pivot table sheet to select the cell where I want the pivot table to be created. This is on cell I1. I'll click OK and then click the Create button. I'll go again and populate the pivot table. This time, I'll be using the country of manufacture, same values as previous ones. Finally, I'll edit and format the column title. I'll be renaming the pivot table sheet to data summary. I'll change that to sales summary. Now I'll do some text formatting on the columns title for all the pivot tables. Notice how I use the paint format tool to change the format for the remaining 2 pivot tables. If you want to know how to use the paint format tool, head over to my channel to watch. To edit any of the pivot table, hover your cursor on the pivot table. You'll see a pencil icon. As soon as you point on the pencil icon, the edit option shows. When you click on it, it brings up the pivot table editor. You can make any changes like changing the order from ascending to descending. We can decide to show or hide the grand totals. Here you can decide to add a filter. Whatever is selected on this filter changes the data in the pivot table. For example, if I select the color blue, only data with color blue shows, and if I clear the filter and select nothing, no data shows. I'll go on to delete the filter. Remember when I said you could change the aggregation? Here's how to do it. Under the Summarize By, when you click on the drop-down arrow, you can see all the aggregation options. Also by the side, you have the Show as Value drop-down. Thank you for staying to the end of this video. I hope you learned something new today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. See you in my next video.